Please join me in giving a warm Minnesota welcome to a very special leader in public health, Dr. Camara Jones.
Thank you, Dean Finnegan. Thank you.
You okay?
I think I'm going to stand. Good afternoon, all, and congratulations to the graduates and to your family and friends. I'm delighted to share this wonderful day, which is all about celebrating your accomplishments, not only in graduating, but all that you've done before to prepare you here and all that you're going to do going forward. And what I wanted to do is just take a few minutes to share some of my work and then to leave you with a charge. So you heard that I just finished service as the president of the American Public Health Association. In that role, I launched our association on a national campaign against racism. And some of your family and friends might be wondering, really? You know, she went around the country talking about racism in 40 states and outside of this country. I mean, didn't people turn her away? I mean, how could she do that? And I'm going to tell you that I was quite successful in doing that because I talk about racism by using allegory. I do storytelling, which can help illustrate topics that are otherwise often quite difficult for us in this country to understand or discuss. So I want to share two of those stories with you right now. The first one, and both of these are based on something that I experienced in my own real life. So the first one that I call Dual Reality, a Restaurant Saga, was based on the time when I was a medical student. And I was studying with some friends in my apartment, and we were studying long and hard, and it got late, and we got hungry, and I had no food in the apartment. But no problem, we decided to go into town and find a restaurant, find something to eat. So we found a restaurant and we walked in and sat down and the menus were presented to us and we ordered our food and the food was served and there we were eating, no problem. I'm hoping that most of you have had that experience before. So it's not very enlightening yet. But as I sat there with my friends, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign, and the sign was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now you're trying to figure out, where did Dean Finnegan say she went to medical school? Like, what could the sign have said? Well, let me tell you what the sign said. The sign said open. So now I know I've lost you. So let me recap. Here we are, sitting in a restaurant, eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open, and if I had not thought anything more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could also come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. But I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, and I recognized that now, because of the hour, the restaurant was indeed closed, and that other hungry people, just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of the sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food, and eat. And then I understood how racism structures open-closed signs in our society. That racism structures a dual reality. And for those who are inside the restaurant, sitting at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even realize that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. It is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. It is difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, except we got a little taste of that with Ebola, did we not? Yet for those on the other side of the sign, they're very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who are saying, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism, it's an empowering thing. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those people on the other side of the sign, and that is an if, but if you do, You could even talk to the restaurant owner, who is, after all, inside the restaurant with you. And you could say, why don't you open the restaurant again? There are hungry people outside. Let them come in. You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we can have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass food through the door, or maybe you'll break the glass or tear down the sign, but at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So I opened with that story because it is so hard for many of us to understand that racism is still alive and well in this nation. Many of us would acknowledge, yes, I understand racism was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history, but many of us would be in denial of the continued existence and profound impacts on the health and well-being of the nation that we have. So I want to define racism for you so you know that we can agree on a definition, and then I will tell my second story, which illustrates 3 levels of racism. When I say the word racism, I am clear that I am talking about a system. So I am not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, but I'm talking about a system of power. And it's a system of doing what? It's a system of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured, and on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on the social interpretation of how we look, which is what we call race. For example, here in Minneapolis, you look at me, I'm clearly black. But in some parts of Brazil, you look at me and I'd be just as clearly white. And in South Africa, you look at me and I'd be just as clearly colored. So here I am, same physical appearance, but the social interpretation of my appearance in those 3 settings would actually assign me to 3 different racial groups. And furthermore, if I were to stay in any of those settings long enough, then my health outcome would become that of the group to which I've been assigned, even though I'd have the same genes in all 3 places. So that's what I mean when I say race is the social interpretation of how we look, and racism is the system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on that so-called race. What are the impacts of racism? Well, when we do think or talk about racism in this country at all, we understand that it unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege you'll sometimes hear spoken that we hardly ever talk about because it makes people uncomfortable. And I hope not to have made anybody in this room uncomfortable, but I'm sure I have. But I'm not trying to make you uncomfortable, so I just want you to shake it off for a minute, because you know what we're going to do tonight? We're going to have a conversation about this commencement speaker, right? We're going to have conversations in all of our in all of our living rooms and around all of our dining room tables. But even as we recognize that, yes, we have a system that's either unfairly disadvantaging or unfairly advantaging individuals and communities, racism has a third impact that we hardly ever recognize, and that is how it is sapping the strength of our whole society through the waste of human resources. And I'll just quickly give you 2 examples. One is how we as a nation are not yet vigorously investing in the full, excellent public education of all of our children, because the blinders of racism have made some people believe that there's no genius in the barrios or in the ghettos or on the reservations or in the refugee resettlement camps, or in all of our communities, that we can get along very well, thank you, without those children. But of course, there is genius in all of our communities. And if we were to only fully and vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation, or even as a world. I sometimes think that we might already be up on Mars farming, if that were a good idea, if we were to invest in all of that genius, right? But we wouldn't even have to go to Mars. We could be solving the problems in our communities today if we were to invest in all of that genius. Another example of how these blinders of racism sap the strength of our whole society is how they have made us complacent with what I describe as the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many black and brown men in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from human potential. And if you know any folks who are stuck in that system or cycling in and out, you know there are many geniuses caught up in that system that, if there were only some other way, could be contributing quite productively to our society. So I actually say, of the 3 impacts of racism that I have described, the unfair disadvantage, the reciprocal unfair advantage, and how racism saps the strength of the whole society, we need a whole lot more attention on that third point. We need more media stories, more data collection. We need more conversations around our dinner tables about how racism is sapping the strength of all of us so that we can actually have more people feel a sense of urgency to dismantle the system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. And I just want to say one more thing before I describe 3 levels of racism. And that is that some people are quite troubled when I talk about unfair disadvantage and reciprocal unfair advantage. People feel like there's disadvantage and then there's normal. But I have to say that because we're ahistorical, many of us do not recognize that our normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. So I'm going to shift now to describing 3 levels of racism that can help us understand how could racism turn into differences in asthma prevalence between communities in our country? How can it turn into differences in obesity prevalence or cancer mortality rates or infant mortality rates? And so these 3 levels of racism, institutionalized, personally mediated, and internalized, I'll very quickly define, give you examples, and then I'm going to illustrate them with my second story, my Gardener's Tale allegory. Institutionalized racism is that constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that taken together result in the differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. So this is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator. This is the kind of racism that's been institutionalized in our laws, customs, background norms. We see it in terms of material conditions like differential access by race to quality housing or equal educational opportunities and the like, as well as through access to power. Access to power is information, could be health information or even information about our own histories, or access to power as voice and media and the government and the like. I'm not going to stay long on that because I don't have that much time. So, but just to say that institutionalized racism explains why we see an association between social class and race in this country, because it includes those contemporary present-day structural factors that perpetuate initial historical injustices. And also institutionalized racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. And very often institutionalized racism shows up as inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. So this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination, and this has many impacts on health, including police brutality or physician disrespect, a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures that patient couldn't afford or wouldn't comply or wouldn't understand. It includes waiter indifference, shopkeeper vigilance, teacher devaluation, on and on. And like institutionalized racism, it can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important for this level of racism is that personally mediated racism can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. And then the third level of racism, internalized racism, I define right now from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. And actually, I've been challenged by many of my colleagues who say, well, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people walk around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? I agree that it is, but I'm not dealing with that today in terms of the detrimental impacts, unless somebody wants to ask me a question, but I know we are not in class today, so I'm going to just barrel on through. But from the point of view of members of the stigmatized races, the impacts of internalized racism are through self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school, or apply to that college, or try to live in that neighborhood or get that job. It turns into what some people call the white man's ice is colder syndrome. That phraseology actually comes from my parents' generation, and what it meant then for people of color, it still means for many of us today. So say that I'm black and I need a lawyer, I might actually seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if I'm black and I'm sick, I might prefer a white doctor over a black doctor. In fact, If my lemonade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Turns into resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, and it's really about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So now I'm going to illustrate these three levels of racism with my Gardener's Tale allegory, based on something I saw with my own real eyes in my flower boxes on my porch in Baltimore, Maryland, but I can't tell you what I really saw. Let me just get straight to the point about this story. So this story is going to be illustrating these levels of racism, and the story starts with a gardener who has two flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, and one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil. And she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, she puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed over in the poor, rocky soil, and 3 weeks later, she sees in her flower boxes what I saw in my actual flower boxes. In that rich, fertile soil, all of the red seed sprouts. The strong red seed grows very tall and vigorous, and even the weak red seed makes it halfway up. In that poor rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies. And even the strong pink seed has to struggle to make it to a middling height. And then in those two flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, the same thing happens. Until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes, and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we interrupt the story there to say the first part of this story illustrates how institutionalized racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil, you had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But we're going to pick the story back up to say, well, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, gardener's looking at her flowers, and she looks at red and thinks, oh, red is beautiful. And then she looks at the pink flowers, and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil, so she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that we sometimes see. And where would internalized racism be in this garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not even understanding or acknowledging that they're benefiting from enriched soil. Pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but of course pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee bzz, into one of the pink flowers, and then bzz, to another pink flower, and then bzz, to this pink flower, and this flower is like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. I'm not making light of that intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, okay, well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with a gardener, or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. It's all good. So we have our workshop, and in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in this garden, we need to address the institutionalized racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if we want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although in my mind it makes it easier for the gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you keep separate boxes, it means that we need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when we do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. So that in that intervention on the institutionalized racism, we'll have also addressed the internalized racism, because pink will no longer be looking over at red thinking that red is better or wanting to be red. And in that intervention, we may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children, who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful, would be less likely to have that kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism and to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the institutionalized racism. Good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the institutionalized, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. So there's one more question before I leave that story, and that is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which in my mind are the elements of self-determination. Who's the gardener? Well, government is a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part, because media, foundations, corporations, communities, to the extent that they have self-determination, can all be part of the gardener. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I paint her red, that's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And so our challenge is what to do about the gardener. Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Many questions can come out of this story, and I really hope that you all will have some excellent conversations over dinner or tonight or in the next few days. But I want to shift now to my charge to you. And my charge to you is threefold. My charge not only to the students, but to all of you all in this room, to all within hearing. The threefold challenge is to be courageous, to be curious, and to be a citizen. So when I say be courageous, I first want you to be unafraid of controversy. I am exemplifying that today, right? And not only be unafraid of controversy, embrace challenge. If somebody offers you an opportunity to be the student speaker or whatever, instead of saying, oh, I don't know if I'm ready, embrace challenge, because that is how you learn your power. You need to follow your passions and forge your own path. Your family and friends have brought you this far, but this is your life, right? So I want you to be courageous in following your own path. The second thing is to be curious. So we as public health workers need to ask the question, why? When we see that, of course it matters what people put in their mouths, but when we see some people eating some kinds of foods and other people eating other kinds of foods, we need to ask why. And then broaden our gaze beyond individual behaviors to the social determinants of health, the context in which people live. And then when we say, oh, but it doesn't just so happen that some people live in neighborhoods with grocery stores and other people live in neighborhoods without. We need to ask why again and broaden our gaze again to what I describe as the social determinants of equity, the things that determine the range of contexts that we see in our community and that determine who's living in which context. So ask that why question. Take that why question with you everywhere. When I say be curious, I mean examine history. We as a nation are ahistorical. You need to figure out, if you're trying to solve a problem, how did it come to be that way? I want you to be curious and burst through the bubbles of your experience. Each of us travels in a bubble. Some of our bubbles of our school and maybe our families and children, our community, some of our bubbles are really thick plexiglass, some are soap bubbles, but each of us is in a bubble. And very often we don't know that just across town there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who live in very different circumstances. So when I want you to be curious, I want you to burst through your bubbles and experience our common humanity across settings. And I want you to be interested in the stories of others, to believe the stories of others, and to join in the stories of others. So the third, I said, be courageous, be curious, and I'm going to leave you with this, be a citizen. Especially in these times, care about the whole. Do not be narrowly focused on yourself as an individual or on any individual. Care about the whole and engage. Contribute your perspectives, because each of you has lived a life that is different from any other life. So contribute your perspectives and then step up and contribute your skills. And finally, stay woke, right? So as I leave you, I have to say congratulations to all of you, to your family members, friends, and loved ones. All of us in this room, all of the faculty gathered here, and all of us surrounding you are so proud of you. And what I want you to say is, Go forth and matter. Thank you very much.